And we are live. Thank you everyone for tuning into this session. I hope you can hear me. I hope it's loud and clear. Okay then. So thank you everyone for tuning into this Hacktoberfest with Aviyel episode 1 of week 2. So we got an overwhelming response on week 1. We were joined by a bunch of awesome sets of speakers and awesome sets of creators, and we had an awesome conversation and chat with them on week 1, and we learned about bunch of open source related stuff, non-code contribution related stuff, technical content creative creation related stuff, and whole bunch of other stuff. On week 1 was fantastic. We got an awesome responses. We got an awesome sets of contribution as well. And yeah, your content is currently under being reviewed. So you should get your responses by the tomorrow evening. So stay tuned and yeah. So yeah, today we are joined by Harsh. So thank you, Harsh, for taking out your time, your valuable time for and joining us in this particular session. So I'll give a bit of an overview of what Hacktoberfest with Aviyel is. So Hacktoberfest with Aviyel, we are focusing morely towards non-code contribution, technical content creation, and we are promoting mainly non-code contribution in general. So the theme of week 1 was to prime you up with the basics of non-code contribution, technical writing, basics of what is Hacktoberfest, what is open source. So week 2 is morely centered and focused towards technical content creation, non-code contribution, and mainly focused towards content contribution. And on week 3 and week 4 is mainly focused on project-based contribution. We have Novu, Metacall, React Plate, Test Sigma, Tolg, and whole bunch of other projects, open source projects lined up. So you can pick one particular project, or you can select multiple projects as well and select the events. You can jump into that particular events, learn about that project in depth, and at the end of the session, you'll receive bunch of topics. You can start contributing on that particular topics. You can create content. You can create whole bunch of content, and yeah. So this week 2 is themed solely towards content creation, technical content creation. So today we are joined by Harsh, and on October 12th we are joined by Yuri as well. So to give a bit of an introduction about Harsh, he has a huge experience in whole bunch of stuff. He's a software engineer, technical documentation writer, and technical content creator as well. So to give a bit of an introduction about Harsh, he was an engineer at Nethermind, Quantsite, QXF2, and he was an active participant at Google Summer of Code, Google Season of Talks, GSOC, GSOD, and not only that, he was a technical content reviewer at Geeks for Geeks, and previously he worked as an SDE intern, software development engineering intern at HackerRank, and not only that, he was an product documentation intern at Red Hat. And currently he works as an open source engineer at Local Stack. So yeah, Harsh, thank you for joining us to this event and making this Hacktoberfest with Aviyel even more brighter. So yeah, the entire stage is yours. You can start with a bit of an introduction about yourself, and you can give a bit of an insight about Local Stack, and then you can proceed to share your slides. And at the end of the session, you will have a Q&A, and we can chit chat about that. So yeah, the stage is yours. You can proceed.
Thanks a lot, Pramit, for the general introduction and detailing what Hacktoberfest is with Aviyel. So first of all, before proceeding with this session, I would like to extend a heartfelt gratitude to Aviyel for inviting me in. I happen to be one of the first folks who had a look at Aviyel, especially because of the developer advocates that were involved with this platform and the kind of relationship that I had with them. So initially, I was a bit skeptic, because of the whole Web3 and the NFTs landscape that Aviyel is working in. But slowly, I I came to realize that Aviyel is not just like a standard Web3 and an NFT platform, but it's also something where communities can sustain themselves. And it's quite great to see a lot of great open source projects coming in here and like building out their communities out there. One of them is Metacall, which by the way happened to be the organization that I participated with during my Google Summer of Code time. So really excited to be here, and thanks a lot, Pramit, and all the developer advocates and event organizers who invited me in. So just a very basic introduction on my side. My name is Harsh, and I'm based out of India. So currently I'm working at LocalStack as an engineer. So for a lot of folks who are not familiar with what LocalStack does, then it's just a local AWS emulator. So a lot of you folks might be using Amazon Web Services as a cloud service provider. So AWS provides a lot of APIs, APIs in the sense like particular services that can help you with a particular business solution. You want to use object storage, you can use something like S3. You might want to deploy your application on a server, you might want to use EC2. You might want to keep all of your Docker containers inside a registry, you might want to use something like ECR. So all of these services are pretty much specific to AWS, and there is no way in which you can develop and test on this. So what LocalStack provides is a local emulator for you to run these services locally. Just think about it, like you can create your Docker images, you can build those Docker images, you can push it to an ECR registry pretty much locally without costing a single thing. You can also like try to run your Kubernetes workflows on your local machine without pushing anything to the AWS that might cost you money. So this is what LocalStack is building, because LocalStack is specifically allowing the developers to shift from a remote cloud development like side of things to a local cloud development side of things. So whatever we are building right now, it should like our local environment should mimic the production environment as closely as possible. So that's one of the goals of LocalStack, and this is what we are building right now. Right now, our product is purely focused towards AWS, but in a few years, we might also see Azure and GCP integration, but this is certainly a work in progress right now. So previous to this, I was working at HackerRank as a software development engineer intern. So pretty much working on building IDs for some of the remote teams out there who might be conducting some remote interviews. And yes, that pretty much explains about me and what I do. So apart from all of the engineering stuff, I have been like neck deep into technical writing. So my initial break into technical writing came through Quora, which was like a very popular question and answer website. So I used to like love writing over there, and within 2 years, I had almost like over 12 million views, which might be like almost 15 million views right now. And based upon that, I started like writing blogs for other platforms, which was mostly centered around military, technical aviation, and all of these things. Before I shifted to like writing about some technical computer science related stuff. So in this whole journey, I worked with companies like Geeks for Geeks, Red Hat, and also like I worked with Mojo Global as an open source contributor, where I was a Google Season of Docs intern. And this has given me a very hefty amount of experience in technical writing and technical documentation development. So with that said, I'll start sharing my screen right now. And the specific talk for today would be mastering the art of technical documentation. So a lot of folks who might have heard about content creation and all of these things, you might have just one particular point in mind, which is creating content for specific social media platforms like LinkedIn, Twitter, maybe some other platforms like Reddit and all of these things. I have been active on most of these platforms, and I know like how technical content should be written out for them. But over here, we are going to work a bit about technical documentation for particular projects, companies, and organizations. Now, there is a certain degree of difference between the technical content that you're creating out for social media platforms and the technical content that you're creating out for documentation sites. One of the first difference is that if you're writing out a technical content for a social media platform, it should be correct only till the point of time you're writing it. So let us say you have came across a very great report and you thought like, hey, let's write a post about this. So you wrote a post about it and like it simply blew up, like hundreds of likes, hundreds of comments. Some of them might be controversial ones, some of them might be supportive ones. Technical documentation cannot be approached in the same way. Technical documentation simply perpetrates a certain degree of truth that is related to that specific organization or the project. So if you're writing about a project, let's say React, or maybe TensorFlow, or maybe Kubernetes, it should follow the exact specification that this particular project follows. You simply cannot like go inside your personal opinions, your personal biases, and write about that project. If you're writing about such a thing, then maybe your personal blog or maybe some sort of a publication would be a really great place to publish it out. Maybe not a very maybe not a like a documentation site would not be a very great place to actually publish this. And this is why technical documentation is so different compared to actual content creation. Because in technical documentation, you need to make sure that if a person is looking at your documentation, they're looking at it for the very first time. So they might be approaching your technical documentation from a pretty much a clean slate. That's one of the first things. Second, it should be subjectively correct, and it should be something that should be maintained over a long period of time. So you just cannot write a technical documentation and just leave it out, because within a few years, the entire thing will simply vanish out in oblivion. One of the good examples of this is some of the React blogs that were written when React was getting popular. So almost 3 or 4 years back, when React was getting popular, a lot of people were writing blogs on React, and they tended to use class-based components as the particular norm, because back then class-based components were pretty much the norm inside the React community. But right now, it's pretty much functional-based components. And if you see those old blogs right now, they are pretty much following the class-based components because they were not written from a documentation point of view. They were simply written as blogs. They were simply written as particular content, and they are not being maintained right now. In comparison, documentation teams always strives hard to make sure that whatever they are publishing it out, it should be subjectively correct, and it should also be maintained over a period of time. So you will always see that technical documentation is being updated, documentation teams have to be maintained, and they need to fill in the caveats around the specific user understanding that they are trying to accomplish. All of this is very necessary if you are creating your own technical documentation. And this is what we are going to learn in today's session right now. So what's the agenda for today? So this talk is very focused towards open source documentation, because closed source documentation team is something that I've never worked with before. So I'll just talk about my experience with open source documentation and how exactly we should go about it, and how you can construct your own documentation teams in pretty much in open source itself. We are going to talk on why documentation is needed for open source projects. And it is not just from the perspective of maintainers, but also from contributors, because most of you might want to know on what exactly is going inside the mind of a maintainer who is looking for documentation-based contributions. Third, we are going to talk about how you can declutter messy open source documentation. This part is very specific to contributors who are looking to contribute to specific organizations but cannot figure out things because their documentation is simply a mess. And finally, we are going to talk on how you can build your own documentation efforts through crowdsourcing, how you can bring more and more contributors in so that they can contribute to your projects. And finally, we are going to wrap up with a Q&A. So I hope that makes sense for everyone else. So does everyone is seeing like what I'm presenting right now, or is there any caveats that are going on? Okay, seems like folks are noticing it. Cool. So if anyone else is like having any troubles, please let me know. I have these slides up on my personal website, so I can share that once this session gets over. But if you are having any troubles, just ping on the public chat about this so that I can just fix it out. Cool. So getting started with open source documentation, that's pretty much the first thing. So let's start with addressing the elephant in the room. What exactly is open source? So again, a lot of folks who might be joining this call would already know what open source is, but just for the new contributors, I can try explaining it once again. In very simple words, open source software is a software that anyone can inspect, change, and share with others. So simply saying code is a part of a program that most users don't have to see. It's kind of like a secret recipe that you are using to develop your stuff out. So open source software doesn't exactly mean it's a free software. It just means that you're putting out your particular code, your particular infrastructure out in the open so that people can progressively develop on it. It's something like a recipe that people can adopt. They can either take the recipe pretty much in the entirety, or they might try to modify this a bit so that it can fit their own tastes. So free software has been always a political movement that has been raging on for the past few decades. Open source is more like a development model that most teams and companies are trying to follow to make sustainable products. Now, with the rise of open source, many companies are making their projects open source so that developers can just come and start collaborating upon. And sometimes these companies also get together to start forming their own communities out there. and foundations out there. For example, with the release of Kubernetes as an open source project, Cloud Native Computing Foundation was formed. With the release of Linux, the entire Linux Foundation was formed. Very recently, PyTorch, which is traditionally a Facebook-sponsored project, Facebook, which is now called as Meta. So they decided that PyTorch should move away from the jurisdiction of Meta. So they have forming a PyTorch Foundation right now to help sustain that project itself. So now you will see that a lot of companies are trying to go open source first so that they can have like a really sustainable and successful project. But now the question that might be coming into your mind is, what are the exact advantages of it? Why exactly does any company should share? So why exactly does any company should care about putting out their project in open source? The very first thing is that it leads to transparency in open source development. You can track your work using public trackers like GitHub issues. You can manage your code reviews using pull request. You can use automated toolings to build and deploy your project. And all of this in just one single platform. And this in turn has a lot of engineering impact. Your bug triaging process becomes much faster. Your user queries are getting much better resolved. And external contributors can collaborate in an easy manner. And this is a fun part about it. Like from my own personal experience, I work with LocalStack. And if you go and check out the LocalStack's main repository, we have a ton of issues coming up. And the good part is that some of these issues that might also come from me, because sometimes some particular service is pretty much unknown to me. Those queries can be resolved by someone who is an external contributor. They might not have as much experience as me working with LocalStack, but they simply figure out things by their own and they provide an answer that is helpful to a lot of new folks. This is what open source basically enables. Without open source, you have to rely upon CRM channels, custom marketing channels, a lot of support channels so that you can exactly solve a lot of user queries. Open source also helps you to mitigate the vendor lock-in, because this is something that most of the companies are pretty against. And it also allows us to redistribute the software that we use and collaborate upon. Right now, you don't have to stick yourself with just one tool or library forever. You can just like use all of those tools or all of those things that you can use for your purpose without locking yourself in. And finally, with the open source projects, a lot of collaboration is being channeled into the community right now. A community isn't just a group of developers. It isn't just a group of technical folks. It can consist of people from all walks of life. It can like include students. It can include teachers. It can include designers, writers, and more of them. And since all of them are collaborating on a software, it is bringing towards a goal of cooperation, which otherwise won't be possible. So now, with the rise of open source projects, there is an inevitable rise of open source documentation as well. And it has like given birth to a lot of new paradigms, a lot of new frameworks, a lot of new widely used practices, workflows that most companies are using so that they can modify their requirements with the upcoming changes that are needed for better felicitation. So that's pretty much what open source is. And let's take a look at what are all the different parts of documentation. So if you're writing out your open source documentation for the very first time, there are various facets of it. And it isn't just limited to just one single file that you write out for each and every group of people. Now, some of these people might be technical folks who might understand on what is going on with this project. Some of these people are the end users who might not have the technical understanding of going deep inside the project and figuring out things themselves. Some of these people might be non-technical users who might be just trying to estimate of whether this project is useful for them or not. So relying your entire project upon a single README file or maybe a single like development file is simply not enough, because it cannot cover documentation for each and every group of people. And if you're like writing a documentation in such a way, it is just a sure shot way of like shooting your project down before it was even born. So most of the documentation for open source project revolve around other parts as well. Let us take a look at some of the other parts that we have right here. The very first one is READMEs and project-specific overviews. And if you go to any open source project right now, you can actually see that every project gets started with a README itself. And as the name pretty much signifies, it is the first point of information and the first point of contact between a potential user or developer and the project. Most of the projects lack a proper README, but the ones who do are usually the ones that are able to find potential users for their product. The second one is reference guides. And this is very, very useful for someone who is looking to get started with the project right now. So they had a look at the README. They now understand what this project exactly does and how it does it. but now they need certain documentation through which they can start using your project. This might include some basic examples. This might include some references around getting started with the project. It might include some documentation to contribute to the project and much more. Many of the popular projects maintain a holistic reference guide to share the context around what the project exactly does. And it should not be just as limited as READMEs. It should be something that encompasses a lot of the features or a lot of the pain points that your project solves out for the rest of the users. Then we have the community specific documentation. And again, this is an essential part to help the contributors understand how to get started with your community. Now, as you're developing out an open source project, as you're writing your open source documentation, intrinsically, you're also developing a community around it. Almost all of the open source projects today are supported by community initiatives in one or the other way. So if you have all the relevant information for new contributors at one single place, it would provide a lot of impetus for them to start contributing to this project and make sure that this project thrives well ahead of the time. Then we have the user documentation, and I guess it pretty much, like as the name is evident, it's the most essential part that completes the usability of the project. Without any substantial user documentation, most people would be lost around how to exactly use this project. And this user documentation should also be the essential guide for a user to do anything. Now, a lot of folks might confuse with the reference guides and the user documentation because every documentation platform tries to use these terms interchangeably. So if you're like following in the same charade right now, it would be better to look at certain documentation frameworks. Like one of them is a very popular framework called as Data Access Framework. And it can actually explain you how to approach various documentation pieces and what are the parts that you can exactly target. And finally, we have like the developer documentation. Like its primary aim is to support the development team as to continuously make new progress and changes in the development path. It is also useful for the other contributors who are interested to know how the technical nits and grits of a project work out. And it provides a very good pathway to like internal documentation effort and make sure that features are communicated well with the stakeholders. Apart from this, like we have some external content that we just create to maintain our community. It might include blogs, videos, YouTube content, and more of that, so that people can just refer to the same for a better understanding. Now, again, since these resources are unmaintained over the years, these can serve the role for the outreach, but maybe not the actual documentation. And this is something that I have discussed out before as well. So what are the tools that you can get started with like while writing a documentation? Now, there are plenty of tools and services that you can use for your documentation efforts for your own open source team. And you can adopt some of these tools for writing your own personal documentation as well. Like, for example, I certainly use the documentation platform called as Docusaurus for a lot of the content that I maintain. And I have like advocated for its adoption in a lot of different open source communities that I am a part of. So picking up on one or two specific tools over here can really help you out in making sure that whatever documentation team you're contributing to, your contributions are landing at a really great place. Now, some of these tools that I mentioned right here, like Docusaurus, ViewPress, Jekyll, Hugo, Altora, Sphinx, like these are pretty much open source projects themselves. And you can actually see like with the continuous releases and the increments to see like how you can make your documentation efforts as seamless as possible. So if I have to say a very opinionated choice, like something that's very, very specific to my use cases, the best way to get started with user-facing documentation is by either using Docusaurus or ViewPress. Now, both of them are based upon React and Vue respectively. And they not only fill in the need for documentation websites, but they also serve as a landing page for the customers. And it is especially useful if you're building out a community which exactly needs a website as well. So with that great deal of flexibility that they offer, it is quite reasonable to start on with the same. We have also got Sphinx, which is being used far and wide across various open source projects, mainly in the Python ecosystem, because Sphinx not only allows you to write user-based documentation, but they also allow you to write developer-based documentation. So you can use Sphinx in conjunction with a platform like Read the Docs, so that you can publish out your documentation website at one single place, and you can simply start making incremental efforts. You can also like integrate it with tools like Doxygen and Breathe, so that you can also start publishing API-based documentation. Like if you have a simple Python project or maybe a C++ project, and you have certain documented APIs that you might want to document, you can simply integrate that with Sphinx itself, and that's a very like a pleasurable thing to use because it just works so well. And this is a feature that is not provided by any other documentation framework out there. Apart from this, we have like other options like Antora, Jekyll, Gitbook. And now the choice of your documentation tools and services is actually driven by the actual needs of the project. Some of these tools are simple static site generators. You just write a markdown and it just converts that to HTML with auto routing and everything. While some of these tools are preferable when it comes to API-based documentation like Sphinx and more of them. So whatever tool you're picking, just try to have an understanding of what exact purpose it is serving out, and then you can start referring it for your own use cases. Now, there are various popular websites out there that exactly explains like some of the various examples of good documentation website. Again, this is a very opinionated example because everyone has their own perception of what a good documentation website looks at. But again, these are some of the references that you can use to understand how good documentation looks like. Most of these documentation sites are exactly open source. I cannot think of any of these sites that are closed source because Fast API, PyTorch, Angular, yeah, all of these are open source right here. So you can exactly check them out. You can check out their open source repositories and you can see like how they're exactly managing stuff. And you can see that there is a huge community out there that is throwing their weight behind developing out this documentation. For example, taking a look at Kubernetes docs, it is backed by CNCF, and you can exactly see a lot of people contributing towards its translation, user accessibility, documenting more and more features in and more of that. Fast API docs within the Python community itself is regarded as one of the best written docs out there. It is so simple that it can allow a person to get started with backend development for the very first time, learn Fast API, make their first API endpoints, and do much more than that. So Fast API, GitHub, Django, these sort of serve as a gold standard of documentation out there, simply because these are written by the people who exactly care about the users that they're serving out. So do make sure that if you're writing out the documentation, you follow the footsteps of like some of these popular projects. I can just probably call it like standing on the shoulder of giants and actually see like how they are managing out their community out there so that it can serve as a template for you to start writing your own documentation projects. So moving on to the next agenda, what's the need for documentation for open source projects? So again, as I mentioned before, a lot of people go under the pre-assumption that, hey, let's write out a project and let the people just figure this out. And this has happened with a lot of the projects in the entire open source ecosystem. Like from my own personal experience when I was starting at Metacall simply had 2 pages, like one was a README and the other one was a developer guide. And apart from this, there was no single document that exactly explains of how you should be contributing to Metacall or how you should be like getting started with this. So if you're a part of an open source community and you're seeing this trend going out, it is the best time for you to actually take the reins of the whole thing and start working to improve this factor. So again, you just cannot go forward with this whole assumption that majority of the developers just simply assume that the code is pretty easy or sometimes it is self-documented and we just don't need the external documentation. That isn't going to happen. So the whole point around this becomes like that there are a few folks in the team who have the intuitiveness, and this costs the users a lot because the other developers or the other users might not have the same accessibility or the same understanding as them, and they fall behind in the race of keeping their documentation well maintained. This is where we realize that the need for open source documentation because it solves the puzzle for a project's usability. And there are various reasons for that. The very first is the documentation basically drives adoption and collaboration. For users, lack of documentation is a big red flag. So you can just take a very simple experiment. You go to any open source project, you see that there is no documentation, no setup guide, no user guide, and intrinsically your mind will just ask you to go to the next project because this is how we exactly work out. We simply cannot work with unmaintained stuff unless and until it's really necessary. So even not just for users and not just for like people who are looking to use the project, also for contributors, it is a no-no since no one would exactly like to contribute without something essential in place. Second, good documentation not only supports users and contributors, it supports collaborators and developers as well. Now, with the engineering teams moving in ever dynamic nature, having good documentation efforts right from the start is essential for everyone so that everyone can just move ahead and understand what is happening. Documentation also ensures transparency because now we understand the workflows, the processes being followed, and the overall design process of the software. This allows the external contributors to not only understand more about the project, but they can also share some of the constructive feedback from time to time so that the engineers can work on the same. And lastly, good documentation paves you for a content infrastructure because it will support your documentation efforts in the long run. So with a content infrastructure in place, with a strong community behind it, it will just prevent the documentation to fall short and like eventually stale away. And it will always pave way for the new contributors to take initiatives, collaborate, and simply move forward. So what are the things that a bad documentation can lead to? I guess this meme exactly explains what might happen in this particular case, and all of you might have understood it quite well. But good documentation is for open source adoption efforts, and bad documentation can just lead you in an opposite direction. So as I mentioned here, a bad documentation can essentially kill your project if you don't provide good support otherwise. Without a proper documentation in place, the user adoption would always tend to be low. And as I mentioned before, without good documentation, most users won't understand the purpose and your project workflow and would have natural apprehensions about adopting your project. Next, lack of good documentation would also put an unnecessary burden on your support and development teams. Because now, if someone doesn't find a documentation for accomplishing a certain task or a certain thing, they will just create an issue on your GitHub repository and you will have a very hard time of dealing all of these issues that are coming up, because the whole issue triage process is time taking and it is difficult. Lastly, the project can simply crumble under the weight of development because the documentation is no longer able to track the development scope and the current scope of work. And there is simply no incentive to continue on with the development if there are no users or contributors coming in. So what scope does a good documentation fill in? So as a whole, documentation should never be a secondary effort. That should be the first and the foremost thing. It should fill in the primary scope, similar to code, similar to management, and documentation essentially should act as a single source of truth. Now, with a wide redistribution of content on community threads, Stack Overflow, like blog posts, YouTube videos, and all of that, a documentation should fill in the need for contributors who would like to refer the actual resource. And this is something that a lot of people say, like, if you're trying to learn something, just refer to the actual documentation, because the rest of the content about that particular thing out there is just referring to one single source of truth, and that's the documentation out there. Documentation should also fill in the need for the information references for support engineers and developers, and also to communicate the necessary plans to the stakeholders. For example, if some particular user is coming up to you and they're like asking for a particular use case, you simply cannot provide them a custom solution which is not particularly open source. At best, you have to redirect them to a documentation piece that they can try to follow and try to emulate, because this is how you actually develop trust out, because no user would like to turn up to you for each and every question that they might be having. Most of the time, they want to have everything documented inside a single source of truth so that they can just cross-reference this for their own development and purposes. And lastly, a good documentation should always ensure to have an infrastructure in place so that it can work towards continuous improvement and delivery to the customers. These are no longer the times when you have to deliver the documentation in a Microsoft Word file or in a PDF file. Most of the folks might want to refer the documentation on a single website. And this is where you need to ship good documentation as well. You should take all the user feedbacks, you should work on them, and ensure that everything is well maintained in a proper infrastructure so that nothing exactly falls short of the time. So this is where we arrive at a concept that sits at the fine intersection between documentation and code. So when we're releasing a particular piece of software, we not only ship the code, we are also shipping good documentation as well. And this is what brings us to one of the most important tenets, or I would just say concepts, that most of the open source projects with well-maintained documentation follow, which is called as documentation as a code. Now, you might have seen like a lot of these terms thrown around a lot, like infrastructure as a code and more of these. But documentation as a code has existed for some time right now. And it is something that most of the open source teams basically swears at. So as I mentioned before, documentation is no longer being stored in like Word or PDF files. And the new needs of documentation have added the scope for version control documentation as well. So again, a lot of folks might be familiar with what version control exactly means. And version control isn't just limited to code or the software. It is also being extended to infrastructure and documentation overall. So by version control documentation, I simply mean that the documentation pieces are being added over a version control system like Git. They are being collaborated over a central like Git provider, something like GitHub or GitLab, and automated pipelines like using GitHub Actions or Circle CI or maybe Travis CI are being used to release these documentation in a continuous manner. Now, this concept was popularized by a certain platform called as Read the Docs, and now it has become an essential part of the content strategy today for most of the documentation teams. Like even right now, when we are setting up a new documentation-based project, the very first thing that we exactly look at is setting up automated pipelines so that we can continuously release our docs with each and every contribution that is coming in. Now, the entire concept of documentation as a code has put up a special emphasis because we now need to track the scope of the work on issues on like GitHub issues or maybe like some other public tracker. We have to use automated toolings to verify the docs. So these automated toolings might include toolings like, let's say, like checking how good your prose is. And this is where most of the companies have started introducing style guides to make sure that their documentation language is really consistent across the entire place. We have also started using external reviews by engineers, by subject matter experts, by documentation writers, so that we can legitimize the documentation piece and the platform so that we can keep on continuously publishing them. Now, all of this ensures that the concept of improving and releasing fast is not just limited to code, but it should also encompass docs as well. So cool, I guess I have covered a lot of content right here. So if anyone has got any questions still now, I'll be definitely be able to take them up. Otherwise, I have been just speaking for the past 30 minutes now. Cool, thanks, Samyak. So a community doc should be focused towards community use. Like, I guess I can show out a demonstration right here. Let me just open up one of the documentation that is pretty much my favorite. So yeah, I guess I can just upload this right here. Yeah, so let's take a look at Kubernetes docs right here. I hope my screen is visible with the Kubernetes docs here. Yeah, awesome. Some of the question has been like, what is the difference between user-facing documentation and community-facing documentation? So in case of user-facing documentation, if I'm a user and if I'm trying to get started with Kubernetes, most of the time I would be looking at is this getting started guide, the concept guide, the tasks, the tutorials, and all of these things right here. If I'm a community user and I'm looking to contribute to Kubernetes, the very first place that I would be taking a look at is this contribution section, because it contains all of the information that is necessary for me to make contributions to this particular community. So you can check a lot of these documentation pieces right here, like how you can suggest content improvements, how you can localize the Kubernetes documentation, how you can work on the reference docs and all of these things. So this is exactly what it means. Like what is the difference between these user-facing documentation and community-facing documentation? Because sometimes the users will have no qualms of like looking at your community-facing docs because they're simply not interested to contribute. They're simply interested to use your software. And they might provide you feedback. They might provide you some actionable things to do on that part. But coming to the community, it is pretty much like limited to the community itself, who might be more interested, not in using your software, but they might be interested more in contributing to your software and in making your project more sustainable at the end of the day. I hope this answers the question out there. So any further questions on this part? Cool. None. Okay, cool. Let's move forward. Cool. So again, how we should be like decluttering messy open source documentation. Now, as I mentioned before, like there are a few projects that have pretty great docs out there. Like if I just go back there, like we have got Fast API, PyTorch, Angular, Django, Flutter, and more of them. Now there are some doc sites that are pretty messy. And when I say messy, like it's something that doesn't exactly allow a user to accomplish what they're looking for to. One of the best examples that comes to my mind is React Docs. So React Docs has a pretty terrible reputation out there because they're simply not very easy to understand and they sometimes just beat around the bush. This is hopefully being resolved with the React Beta Docs, which is like pretty much sitting inside a particular subdomain called as beta. So you can just go to beta.reactjs.org and you can check out the new documentation that they're developing, which is super fast, which is super helpful, and it is much, much better than what they had originally. So again, if you are looking to contribute to any open source community out there, and you just see that they have a very messy documentation practices that they're following, perhaps it's a great chance for you to contribute to that and make sure that you just fix all of these things out before the project enters into a stage where things simply go unsustainable. So one of the main reasons why there is a messy open source documentation is most of these documentation pieces are not following any standard practices. So let's be honest to ourselves. If we are building out a documentation site and we have a team of documentation writers or documentation developers who are writing up different stuff and integrating them out, it becomes really hard for the maintainers to actually maintain a consistency across a doc, because every writer has got their own style of writing. Everyone might be looking at it from a different angle, and everyone might have a different expertise. So a documentation piece that you are writing right now might be simply something that someone else cannot understand exactly. While sometimes the documentation piece that you're writing out is so fine-grained that people who are looking for more complex use cases will simply find no use of it. So this is where we arrive at a concept called as documentation style guides, technical writing style guides that allow the technical writers to standardize their documentation practices. Now, there are a lot of style guides out there. Like if you can just go and search, like let's say Microsoft style guide or maybe Apple style guide, you can exactly see the style guides that these companies are maintaining right now. Let me just showcase the Microsoft style guide right here because it happens to be one of my favorite. So Microsoft style guide pretty much contains all of the information that you need to make sure that you're writing out a consistent piece of documentation out there. So all of the documentation writers, all of the documentation developers who are contributing to Microsoft's documentation, they are pretty much following this standard style guide itself to make sure that their like language, their way of writing is pretty consistent with the overall Microsoft vision after all. We also have the Google style guide that I had previously used for one of my own documentation-based projects. And it happens to be so good because it just covers a lot of nits, grits, and particular use cases that most of the people won't be ever thinking about. So I can just go to Google's style guide and you can see like it contains a lot of information about language, grammar, general principles so that you can be accessible to more and more folks across the world, punctuations, formatting, linking, how to mention these computer interfaces, how to like format your HTML, CSS, and more of that. So actually like forking one of these style guides and like making your own modifications on top of them is really great, because now you don't have to like exactly worry about incompleteness or like particular use cases that you're missing out. You can just inherit a particular style guide and you can like start developing on it. Like maybe make your own custom changes according to the software or according to the documentation piece that you're writing out. But all of this basically serves as a very great place for you to get started with to make sure that your documentation is really consistent with the overall outlook of your documentation plan. Apart from this, we also like have to make sure that the development team should not assume that the user should understand everything. And as I mentioned before, it is usually disastrous if this happens, because most of the people like they carry this notion that the software interface should be intuitive enough so that we don't need additional docs to understand this. Turns out that this approach really works, and this is why the documentation pieces turn messy. Now, most of the documentation on open source is unreviewed today, and it basically leads to more failures than successes. So you also need to make sure that there is no lactation between the documentation team and the developer team, because if there is a certain regression in the connection that should be between the documentation and the development teams, it can just add to your further woes because there is no back and forth feedback loop over the contribution itself. So every time you are setting out a documentation team, you really need to make sure that there should be a feedback loop with the developers, with the project managers, with the product managers, and more of them, so that you can keep on continuously improving your documentation quality. And there should be an active connection where the developer teams can pass on the feedback to the documentation team, and the documentation team can ask their questions to the developer teams based upon certain things that they might be noticing out. One of the things that I have seen in one of my previous experiences, and this is something that my own manager told me, the documentation writers are usually the first users of a particular product, and they are the ones who are also documenting it. So if you're a part of the documentation team, and if you're like documenting a certain feature that an engineer has developed, you really need to make sure that you're giving them the right feedback and you're getting all the answers to your questions before the things exactly turns messy. And this is how you can go about decluttering your messy open source documentation. So again, as I mentioned before, there are like specific style guides that you can follow out so that you can like entirely make sure that your documentation efforts are consistent and your documentation pieces are standardized. But now these style guides are pretty long, and there is no one single person who can exactly read the whole style guide and try to make sure that everyone is following the same standards. This is where we arrive at a concept of using continuous integration pipelines so that we can start testing out these docs inside CI providers like GitHub Actions or Circle CI and more. Now, this exactly sounds very intriguing because this is something that most of the people have not figured out yet, but it's very exciting as well. So a lot of the projects that I have been contributing to, they particularly use like these style guides to make sure that all of the language is consistent and like everything is pretty standardized inside these docs as well. And one of the primary platforms that basically heralds this is Errata AI's Whale. Now, Whale is a syntax-aware prose linter that I'm basically recommending every documentation team to use. And what it does is like it basically tests your documentation and it figures out on what are the things it needs improvement with. So as you can see out a very basic demonstration here, someone just made a documentation-based contribution. And as you can see, Will automatically suggests out suggestions, errors, warnings, and more of them so that we can possibly make changes to our documentation and we can really satisfy a particular style guide itself. So with the Whale, your team can adopt like maybe the Microsoft style guide, maybe the Google style guide, or something else itself. You can also create your own style guide with your own specifications out there. And this is what makes Whale so awesome at the end of the day. So Whale is an effective tool if you're looking out for much standardized documentation and to build out your documentation on a really consistent manner. And there are some other services as well, sorry, the other style guides as well that you want to take a look at. So inside this the docs repository, we have the Whale styles, which you can adopt for your own purposes. Or maybe if you want to just use those standard style guides like the Google, Microsoft, WriteCode, or ProseLint, you can just go to Errata AI's styles repository and you can just check out whatever is particularly suited to you. So how exactly should you be standardizing documentation right now? Now, this is a very interesting question because documentation pieces, unlike content development, should not require a lot of creative freedom. If you're like writing out a creative content for a social media platform or maybe for your blog, you sometimes really need to be not creative to exactly capture the attention of the other person. In comparison, documentation pieces are supposed to be bland because that's the exact purpose that they are serving out there. So if you're looking to standardize your documentation, you really need to make sure that you are weeding out all sort of creative writing out of your documentation site. And how to exactly do that? There are a few ways out there. The very first thing is you can start creating predefined templates so that you can capture the essential details during the documentation effort. So back when I was developing, when I was working with my mentors over at Mojo Global during Google Season of Docs, we pretty much had predefined templates so that we can write each and every piece of doc. So if we're writing out a procedure, we will follow the same template. If you're like writing out a user guide, we will follow out a certain template. If you're like writing out a contribution guide, there would be a certain template that we would be exactly following out. Now, these predefined templates were quite helpful for us because we didn't have to write redundant information all and all over again. We just have to mention the basic nits and grits and the caveats, and we are pretty much done with this. Second, we also need to identify all the user-centric changes in our documentation and make sure that they are documented continuously with every change. So you really need to make sure that you have a consistent line with the developers. And every time there is a change that is being released, and it is something that the users will get to see when they're using your software, it should be converted into a GitHub issue or maybe some sort of a ticket on an issue tracker. And it should be documented continuously with every change that is going inside the open source code base. Third, if you're looking out to become something like a documentation manager or someone who manages your entire documentation repository, you should also try to set up some standard workflows so that every time someone is adding a documentation piece, it should be really published out with a standard review and publish process. And this is pretty much standard to almost every documentation team out there. Every documentation team has a certain review and publish process so that engineers, subject matter experts, or developers can review your documentation piece before it is exactly published out. And finally, do make sure that you're conducting reviews with the team so that you can analyze the context. You can get to see on what are the parts that your documentation is simply failing out, and what are the ways in which you can further improve your project out there. And yes, as I mentioned about the automated reviews, feedbacks, and the continuous integration process, you can start relying upon continuous integration providers like GitHub Actions so that you can check if your documentation is really compliant with style guides, especially the ones that are offered by Whale. You can also start setting up subject matter experts. These subject matter experts are the ones who have the most technical authority over a certain feature that is being documented. And you can take all of the feedback so that it is updated continuously and your documentation is moving towards the right channel itself. You can also like start setting up peer review channels so that you can collaborate with the other documentation developers, or maybe sometimes with the developers itself, to actually get suggestions for improvements on what are the things that we can focus on. For example, when I was working at Red Hat, we simply had these documentation review meetings when we used to take up a really old and a really bad documentation, and we used to just talk about what are the things that we can do to improve this piece of documentation. So it was a really good exercise for new documentation writers to understand on how they should be like writing good documentation. And it's an exercise that almost every documentation writer out there should be trying to follow. And finally, having feedback surveys directly integrated on your user-facing documentation is really helpful. And it is something that most of you might have noticed in other documentation sites, because now you can just go over there, you can say thumbs up if this documentation piece has helped you, or you can just send up a feedback if this documentation piece has not helped you, so that the documentation writers can particularly help you out by making the documentation more accessible. So if you're looking forward to build out your documentation site, this is like the kind of the strategy that you should try to follow out. The very first thing is like always try to provide a quick start to the new contributors so that they can get started with all sort of documentation related work and issues. Perhaps this quick start might include where they can find the issue tracker, where they can find particular things to work on, what is the contribution guide, like what are the exact steps that they should be following while putting out their documentation work, and how they should exactly go about asking the maintainers for the reviews and collaborating with them to ensure that it gets merged. Second, as a contributor, as a documentation maintainer, you also need to find out the areas where you can improve on so that you can plug in the efforts from various contributors to work on and collaborate. So if you're like working on your documentation, you just figure out that this particular feature has not been documented yet, you should be good enough to delegate this task to other contributors, maybe some first-time contributors who are exactly looking for new things to work on, so that they can start collaborating and they can start working on your documentation effort. Third, always try to develop some external user-centric documentation so that you can signify the purpose of each project. Now, this user-centric documentation always fills in a necessary critical gap, but it also includes like writing some external pieces like blogs, or maybe like some reference guides, or maybe like some like creating some external content in form of YouTube videos or social media content and more, so that people can get to know about your project and they can also get started contributing to it. And finally, always try to work towards improving the contributor experience. So build out learning courses, build out contribution guide, build out documentation related workflows, set up some meetings so that you can always help out new contributors in contributing to your documentation. If you're putting out necessary efforts in the necessary upbringing and the well-being of the contributors, you can be damn sure that they would get to be a part of the infrastructure, and they would make sure that your documentation like effort is totally sustainable over the coming years. So if you're like looking out to define a consistent content strategy, because this is what most of the documentation pieces follow, you really need to like figure out on what purpose does each resource particularly follows. So first we have the resources, which might include project docs, they might include case studies, they might include white papers, they might include project architecture. Other than this, we have the branded content, which might include blogs, guest posts, community stories, learning courses, news, and more of that. One of the good examples where I can showcase on how we have implemented this in the past is the Mojo Global's community website. So over here, you can see that we have project-specific documentation inside a specific page called as projects. We have then some branded content, which is in form of blogs. And this is what we use for creating a certain degree of outreach for the Mojo Global community. Then we have like some community-facing documentation, which people would be following out to exactly know how they should be contributing to our like projects and our open source repositories. And finally, we have like some branded content like initiatives, case studies, tutorials, and more of that. So this is like one good way in which you can model out your content strategy. Again, if you're not very, very sure of content strategy, you can always pick up upon a particular documentation framework, and you can start working on that so that you have something really consistent in place. One of the popular examples that I mentioned previously is that access framework. And finally, always make sure that you're writing with purpose. So every time you get onto a documentation piece, always try to ensure that you have a certain degree of freedom in your mind and a certain degree of flexibility. And some questions that you have answered out previously as well, like what is the exact goal that you're writing out this documentation? What is the message that you need to put out? What is the persona that you're writing for? Is this documentation coming from like an experience point of view, or is it from a novice point of view? What action do you exactly want the user to take upon after they read this documentation? what is the value that you want to share, and how can you be further consistent and concise with all your writing efforts. Simply remember, like, and this is a very popular writing code that I remember, but I don't exactly know whom to attribute this to, that if you're a documentation writer, always strive to write less, because the less you write, the better you will be able to put forward a very strong word. Because if you're writing more, you're just simply confusing the hell out of the reader. So always go with the least amount, always go with the concise documentation, which is really consistent with your overall content strategy out there. And if you're building out a docs team, there are a few tips. The very first one is like always try to start small. There is no need of going inside some like hefty documentation like writing white papers or writing case studies and all of that. Always make sure that you're defining those parts that need the absolute immediate attention. These might include the user guides, these might include the community guides and more of that, because this is something that will exactly help your documentation project to set apart. Next, try to identify the users and what sort of expectations they have from a documentation overview. This is a point where you can try organizing some documentation surveys to see like what kind of documentation do the users are exactly looking for, so that you can strive towards making all those documentation accessible to them. Third, try to ensure that your team adopts all sort of automated toolings, CI providers, CI pipelines, and all of that, so that you are able to publish your documentation in a really consistent manner. And you're also able to collaborate with the stakeholders and the developers so that you can identify the areas of the work. And finally, keep your documentation open, accessible to all, and make sure that your documentation doesn't scatter across multiple projects and stakeholders. Because if your documentation is not centralized in one place, your users are going to have a hell lot of time basically navigating to each and every project and trying to figure out like how these things exactly work out. A good example in this case would be checking out of how like a company like HashiCorp does it. So for a lot of folks who are not familiar with what HashiCorp does, so they basically have a lot of developer tools out there that they are building out. And some of them are very popular, like Vault, Terraform, and more of them. And they were facing this entire problem that all of the documentation was pretty scattered across each and every specific project. So they created something that is called as developer.hashicorp.com. And it's really effective because it combines the documentation of all of the projects that they're offering right now. So Terraform, Packer, Vault, Nomad, Waypoint, Vagrant, all of the documentation pieces that are associated with HashiCorp as a company is now consolidated at a single place itself. So you can just go to Vault, you can check out the general documentation, you can check out the use cases, the get started guide, and this is how you can go about like understanding the various software services within HashiCorp itself. So yeah, that pretty much brings us to the end of this session. We are almost 2 minutes before the end of it. So thanks a lot for sticking with me till the end, and I would be happy to take up any Q&A right now. So if you want to further connect with me on any of the social media platforms, you can just find me by my username. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yep, it was a really awesome session. It was so awesome. I learned a lot about standardizing and style guides. So yeah, it was an amazing session. Thank you so much, Sas, for joining us today. Yeah, but there are a few questions that we have.
Sure.
From Enigma as well. So what does Errata AI do exactly? Does it convert our docs into the respective Google/Microsoft doc styles?
So what Errata AI basically does is like it scans your documentation, which might be in form of Markdown, because this is what most of the documentation team uses. And it tries to compare this with the standard documentation style guides that Microsoft or Google is offering. So if there is a certain passive voice that they have noticed out, most of the style guides basically ask us to not to like write our sentences in passive voice. They try us to use active voice actively, because our mind always converts the passive voice to active voice almost intrinsically. So you can exactly notice that the Errata AI will basically flag that, hey, you have written out this sentence in passive voice, please convert this into active voice. In some other places, you might also notice that you might have used a wrong capitalization. A lot of people basically suffer from this, but what they do is like for each word in the sentence, they will capitalize the very first word. And it's not a very good practice out there. So a tool like Errata AI's Whale, what it will do is like it will just scan your entire documentation piece, and it will provide you constructive feedback of what exactly you need to fix out. So this is a very powerful software, and this is something that a lot of documentation team basically struggle with when they're adopting it for the very first time. Because once they install Whale, they will get to know like, hey, this is how messy our documentation is. This is how our language is not consistent at all. So if you're following the same like persona, and maybe you want to go with something simpler, there is also another project called as PyCodeSpell. So I can like basically share this project inside the chat. And this is what one of the projects that I was working with actually adopted by throwing Whale out, because they just wanted a very simplistic thing which can check for typos or check for like standard grammatical errors. So this is what CodeSpell is. And it's very simple, like just install it as a pre-commit hook. And every time you're making out a commit on your local machine, it will run your entire documentation through the CodeSpell, and it will just fix out any typos or any standard grammatical issues that it might encounter. So again, there are a lot of documentation toolings that are being developed, and the whole documentation landscape is more and more looking out for like people who can basically improve the developer experience of documentation developers. So if you have some idea for a documentation tool, you can also start developing it out, something to make the job of writers much better and much easier.
Oh, that's a really awesome tool. CodeSpell.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
So yeah, there is one another question from Esther.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the organization you write for is expected to have its own template and style guide, right?
So again, not a lot of organizations are following any standard style guide. Like I can place a lot of bet that some of the projects that I mentioned as a hallmark of great documentation are not following any style guide. So it is always a good point to like propose these style guides to them so that they can start adopting it out. But again, it's a very bureaucratic process because not a lot of people are fan of these style guides. And sometimes people might just thinking that they're trying to enforce a certain standard upon the entire documentation team. So again, not everyone is a fan of Google or Microsoft. So they might have a certain friction in adopting these style guides out. And that's the reason why companies have started developing out their own style guide. I remember when I was in Red Hat, we had this IBM style guide because Red Hat is a part of IBM itself. And that style guide was almost 800 pages long. So we were expected to follow that style guide from end to end, like including commas, full stops, capitalization, and what we exactly call certain software components. So we cannot call it a command prompt, we have to call it a terminal. So these are the things that certain style guides basically enforce the limits to. Again, these style guides are pretty flexible, so you can like toggle their strict options on. So sometimes you can just toggle a style guide to only like mark an error if you are making out a technical typo mistake or maybe like something like a grammatical mistake. But if you're like following out a passive voice or maybe if you're capitalizing something else, it will just not call that out. It will just put it out as a warning and you can just safely ignore this. So you have to like basically propose this to organizations if you're looking to work with the style guide. And for predefined templates, it's almost like useful for everyone else out there because most of the folks are like just copy pasting like standard stuff. And they just like technically remove some of these parts out so that it can make sense for the documentation piece that they're writing out. So developing out these standard practices inside any organization is really, really helpful, and it will just help you set apart in the documentation team.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I hope that answers your question, Esther. So yeah, I have one basic question. So what was your first ever open source contribution? Which project that you ever? Yeah.
So I remember my first contribution was to a data structure algorithm repository. So it was back in 2019 Hacktoberfest that I started contributing. And I was like just sitting in a library trying to learn from a Python course. And one of my seniors came to me, like he was one of the most influential seniors that I had. And he just said to me, like, whatever you're doing is not going to make it out. So like in Web3, we just say like NAGMI, like not going to make out something like that. So, so he was just saying like, it's not going to make out. So I was like, okay, what should I be doing to make sure that I make out? So he just said like, okay, you start contributing to open source. Hacktoberfest is going on and you will find plenty of projects to contribute to. So I picked up on the very basic project that I could find. So we had a coding club in our college and it had a data structures and algorithms project out there. So I just contributed a very simple insertion sort or selection sort algorithm. And I just like contributed 4 more pull requests like this. And that's how I got a t-shirt. But it was a very great start because after Hacktoberfest, I started contributing to much better projects and much larger projects. And it has been totally because of the mentors that I got. So this is one thing that open source basically helps you set apart from the rest of the folks. You get a really nice folks to work with. So
So basically, your starting point was from the Hacktoberfest itself.
exactly.
So yeah,
So
so yeah, it was an awesome journey. It was an awesome session. I mean, this session was so detailed and outlined. I really enjoyed. So I hope our audiences enjoyed our session as well. So yeah, thank you, Harsh, for joining us to this.
definitely.
So yeah,
Cool. Have a
thank
good
you
rest
everyone
of the day.
for thank you everyone for tuning into this session as well. So yeah, we'll basically reveal this topic for the week 2 now. So you can go check it out to the chat section at the public. So there should be an Discord link. You can join the Aviyel server, check out the Hacktoberfest with Aviyel channel, and there will be a bunch of topics that you can work on. So you can select one particular topic, write on that particular topic. You have up to October 18th, 1 week period, eight days period to write on that particular topic. And once you are done with it, you will receive a separate link to submit your submission. And yeah, that's the week 2 for now. And yeah,
Awesome.
thank you, Hers, for joining us and making this session even more brighter. And I learned a lot, and I hope our participant has also learned a lot. So yeah, I'll save the link of the slides, or you can save the link.
Sure. I'll just do that right now. It's Aviyel at harshgasper.com. I just put the link over the chat right now. So yeah, here it is. Awesome.
Okay then. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for everyone for tuning in. So hack with the Hacktoberfest.
Have a
Bye
great day,
bye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.